Well, Kate, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about your fantastic book, The Dress Diary: Secrets from a Victorian Woman's Wardrobe. It was fascinating, and I really appreciate your time.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be able to chat about it with anyone who wants to listen.
Yes, and I'm so glad we can bring this to an audience over the pond, if you will, and bring this to life because we think about Victorian England in so many different ways, and this really underscores something important to me, which is material culture. When did you realize that material culture or history in general was important in your life?
I was definitely one of those kids who had felt a kind of affinity with old places from a very young age. So my parents would take us to places. So I'm in the southwest of England, and there's lots of stuff going on. So we would go to castles and we'd go to historic houses, and I used to love it. But what I realized is that as much as the spaces themselves, it was often the stuff that people used that I was fascinated by. So I would love looking at like the spoons or if there was an object that somebody had that was associated with somebody. And I realized it's that idea of objects being part of somebody's story, somebody's world. And I think it gradually uh, focused itself onto clothing because I think in many ways, I remember a curator that I worked with early in my career said that dress is like the ghostly outline of people that came before.
Hmm.
They are the closest things we get to a ghost in a way because they take on the shape of the wearer, they take on the
Hmm.
characteristics of the time. And so clothing just seemed to represent the lived experiences of people in the past. And I think that's why it drew me in and became my chief kind of way in from a material culture perspective.
Hmm. I love that thought that that's kind of like their spirit living on through that product, if you will, of their
Yeah.
time, because it does really take on the shape and it's made for the wearer, especially at that time. They don't
Yeah,
have the mass
exactly.
production.
And I think with if you ever look at historic dress collections and I've worked in some over the years, it's particularly if you see things that have been mended or things that have a stain on them and all of those stories that are kind of embedded in the textiles and that's what completely I was just enthralled by this idea that they had existed in these other spaces and had
Mhm.
stories to tell that were kind of locked away.
Mhm. Yeah, that's fascinating. And as someone who loves material culture and who thought that if I didn't go into the history field, I was actually going to go into fashion because I loved the idea of materials and how we use materials. This book was it just hit home for me where it was like, wow, I can understand why Anne, who we'll talk about shortly, kept all these remnants of her past. And
Mm.
you say early on in the preface of your book something that really resonated with me, and I'd like to read the passage for you and get your thoughts on this. You say the field of dress history has been an academic discipline that has had to fight for recognition amongst more traditionally respected scholarship. The study of clothing has the study of clothing being perceived as an ephemeral concern. There have been many occasions during my own career where I have been introduced at an academic conference as a historian studying, cue the long pause and raised eyebrow, quote, fashion. What is it like uh, being seen as a fashion historian and by others who think that it's not traditional? How does that make you feel as a professional, Kate, to really have to fight your kind of battles to make this be seen as a relevant topic in some circles?
It's been often frustrating because I think there is that sense that uh, that it really is of little real import in the kind of broader field of historical studies or the humanities or art. You know, it seems to fall into that. Lots of people say, well, fashion isn't art. And then other people will say, well, fashion history isn't real history. It seems to fall between these many different topics. And I think partly it's because it's that association traditionally and historically, the idea that fashion is about what it is to be female and frivolous, and all of those kind of pejorative terms that go with the idea of fashion. Um, and so it's a very deep-seated kind of issue that is definitely improving. There are, I think, the number of fashion studies programs now and amazing journals and scholars, it's definitely improved over the last couple of decades, but it's still frustrating to get that kind of response, which is not uncommon. And I often say to audiences, if I'm lecturing, particularly to some of the more kind of perhaps traditional audiences here in the UK, and I quite often say, look, if you were sat here wearing nothing, or if you were sat here all wearing exactly the same, then I might agree that dress doesn't matter. But actually, you know, the fact that you are all wearing clothes, and the fact that you're all wearing something different based on however many choices, whether it was cultural, religious, climate based, whatever it might have been, you made a choice about what you wore this morning, and so therefore it matters hugely in the human experience. And I kind of leave it there and hope that they take it away with them.
Oh, it certainly mattered to the subject of your book, the person, the main character in your book, Anne Sykes, with this history of keeping a record of fashion and what it was like for her and those in her sphere. Tell us about how you came into getting this beautiful diary of Anne Sykes and the journey that it has taken.
I pre-pandemic I still am a lace maker, and I live in a part of the UK where we have a tradition of a particular kind of handmade bobbin lace, and I had learned it as a young woman, and once a month I would go down to a particular group near where I lived, and it was lots of older women who had been making it for a long time, and so they were great at kind of they felt like elders really that were sharing their knowledge with me. And after one of the group meetings that we had, one of the older women had come up to me after the class and said that she had a whole ton of stuff that she was disposing of. She was moving apartments and just needed to downsize. So I went down. This was in 2016. I went down, and she gave me a whole load of stuff that she had kind of just acquired through a long career in the theatre, it turned out. So she was the wardrobe mistress in a large London theatre. And really this object that she pulled from a trunk at the bottom of her bed was the very last thing that she drew out, and she'd forgotten she had it. I think it had just sat there for decades, really. And so it was this parcel that was wrapped up in brown paper, and when I unwrapped it, it was this amazing album, and you could tell immediately that it was very old because it was frayed and very fat. You know, it was bulging with something. And she said that a guy who was working with her in the 1960s in London had visited Camden Market one Sunday and just basically bought this thing from like a junk store for a few pence and gave it to her. And then she had it traveled with her for the rest of her life, and until she gave it to me. And so it was anonymous, and it was this kind of amazing curiosity, as I thought then, with no known kind of provenance or origin.
Mm-hmm. How did you start to uncover the provenance with it, Kate? How did you really dive into this to truly research it in a new way?
I could tell that it wasn't going to be easy from the beginning, because the captions, I think because it was created in the way of a kind of autograph album, memorializing people, full of fabric. So there are over 2,000 swatches of cloth in the book, little swatches that were cut to into octagonal shapes that were pasted very carefully into this album. And every swatch had a different name above it, or sometimes names that were repeated frequently. But they were always written in the third person. So it was kind of like quite a distant record of people, years, dates. It wasn't a personal journal in that way. There weren't lots of captions saying, oh, here's my lovely gown I wore at this particular time. It was very quite disciplined in a sense. But there was, luckily, so I had started to transcribe all of these captions, counted over 100 different names of many different, predominantly women in the book. And luckily, just once, she kind of, whether she slipped up, whether it was intentional, I don't know. But there was just one caption out of the kind of 2000 swatches where she kind of slipped into the first person, and she said, dress worn by Anne Sykes, May 1840. And then she just wrote next to it in tiny writing, it said, the first dress I wore in Singapore. And it was just that one and only time. And that's what then allowed the entire volume, the entire journal, to kind of unfold, kind of deliver its secrets, really, because anyone who's done that kind of genealogical research will know that once you get an anchor, you know, one name, some dates, that can be the thing that just opens up the whole thing. And that's what happened.
It's an amazing detective story when it unfolds in that way. I think that's why a lot of us get hooked into archival research or genealogy or something. It's just we're our own detectives, and we got to figure out the puzzle.
Yeah.
You know?
And actually, it was an amazing puzzle for me at this time, because I had started the bulk of the research, or certainly the written part, where I was researching and writing at the same time at the beginning of 2020. And it was always going to be a piece of research that I was planning to do in archives around the UK. But then with the first lockdown, it meant that I was kind of tied to my desk. And this became an entirely different detective story, because it was one that had to be conducted remotely, relying on archives that were thankfully digitized. I've often wondered whether it would have been a completely different kind of, how it would have been had I not been just kind of exploring Anne's world from my desk rather than venturing out into some of the places that she lived. So yeah, it was very much a kind of pandemic book.
Who was Anne Sykes and her husband Adam? Are they pretty well-to-do people, or what kind of people were they as far as class, and how does that impact their wardrobe?
Anne was the daughter of a prominent mill owner in Lancashire. So she was living in the region, so around Manchester, which was known as Cottonopolis, that kind of really amazing explosion of the industrial system, the kind of factory system as it was called. She had grown up in that world. Her father had made his money. He was that new money industrialist. And so by the time Anne has grown up and is reaching the age where she was going to get married, she had enjoyed a comfortable life. You know, they were he had 4 mills, employed over 1,000 factory hands. So they were well to do in that way, but not the kind of old money. Were driven by class in the UK, as I'm sure many of you know. And so certainly the kind of wealthy family, but not of the old money, and that will have impacted in some way at some point. Adam was a merchant, predominantly based out of Liverpool for much of his early career, and they married in Tyldesley, which is the mill town where her father had his mills, on the 20th of September 1838. And so they were a kind of solid middle class, verging upwards because of their income. So yeah, comfortable. And that meant that Anne did have access to lots of different textiles, and she did have the kind of disposable income that meant that she was buying, she would buy cloth for clothes and enjoy her wardrobe, as did the women around her. And that, I think that's why the number of fabrics in the book are so prolific.
So she really, with the way her father operates his businesses and such, she really has this idea of textiles in her DNA, and it's kind of like it's almost a given that she's going to gravitate towards that, unless she's rebellious, which she's not, apparently.
No, I don't. I think you're right. I think it's this kind of albumization practice was quite common for women at this time. That the usually it would be things like poetry, or it might be collecting autographs, or scrap pressed flowers and scraps of verse, that kind of thing. So the practice of these albums was a common one, but I think Anne was probably drawn to this idea of memorializing people through cloth just because it was so central to her world. Her father had been involved with calico printing at an earlier stage of his career, that real kind of technologically advanced process of applying pattern to particularly to cotton. And so she will have had her own great literacy in that material culture, in that kind of in textiles and fabrics. And I think, you know, the other really important thing about textiles is that it does remind us of time and place. You know, you can think of perhaps a garment that you owned, and if you were to save a swatch of it and look at it 10, 20 years down the line, you would remember when you wore it and what that kind of stood for. And I think that's what that came to mean for her.
I thought of that actually when I was reading through the book, uh, as someone who was a historical interpreter for over 20 years. I thought it would have been neat if I would have thought ahead and kept little pieces of the uniform cloth, because just feeling it would remind me of those moments,
Yeah.
that were really key to my younger days. And
Mm.
and I'm sure that's what Anne is, thinking as well, because this isn't for nothing.
Yeah.
Uh this is very therapeutic maybe for her.
And I do wonder if in later years she may have sat, you know, with the book on her knee and kind of leafed through the pages and recalled the women that were in there, women that some of the women she met fleetingly and didn't stay in her life for very long. Some were women that were with her for many decades,
Mhm.
as we all experience. And so, yeah, I'm sure that must have been a kind of treasured memory book in many ways.
Mhm. And this is someone from Victorian England who's traveling, going to Singapore and other places with her husband. Back in England, how is Victoria impacting fashion at that time? Is she impacting fashion? Is she being a monarch who is impacting how we see it? Almost like as we saw with, for example, Diana back in the 90s impacting stuff. Is Victoria doing that in the 19th century?
She was aware. I think the perception that we have of Victoria, particularly once her husband, Prince Albert, had died, was
Mhm.
that she kind of was preserved in aspic, and that she just retreated into this black, bleak figure who was unchanging. And there's an element of truth in that. But certainly in her younger years, she came to the throne in 1837 at a very young age, just
Mhm.
a year before Anne and Adam married. So it's interesting. I think her reign is almost mapped against
Mhm.
Anne and Adam's life. So the early years of her reign, she did wear. She was interested in clothes, and she did have. She was mindful of how important it could be. So she was one of the first monarchs. When she travelled to Ireland, for example, she had a cloth woven in shamrocks uh, as a tribute to the country that she was visiting, and that hadn't really happened a great deal before. And now, of course, it's very normal for that to happen. The idea of making a kind of diplomatic sartorial a piece of flattery that is usually very successful. So she was doing that then. But
Mhm.
when Albert died, she of course wore black for the rest of her life, which was in its own way really influential, because it did kind of help to emphasize the cult of mourning that was to become such a embedded part of the etiquette of grief at that time. And so in that sense, she was influential. And she did write to her children and say, you know, watch out for fashion. Don't be too fast. Don't be too extravagant. People will notice. So
Mhm.
although she wasn't kind of performing fashion herself in her later years, she kind of recognized that people would pick up on it.
Mm. And for all those listening, I didn't mean to equate Diana with Victoria. I meant the royal house. There are people within the royal house who sometimes
No,
impact
exactly.
stuff
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that.
And there's
I
and
don't.
that's no, I think it's a really valid point. The idea that you know, when you have a constitutional monarchy that is um, power comes, it's like the soft power of dress comes in, has come in very handy for the British monarchy in across many generations, and it's played an important role.
Mhm. For Anne's sphere, what is it like wearing all these layers? Because I know some of my followers are like, how in the world did they wear all these layers, and why did they wear all these layers of clothing? And you go into that in the book, and I would love to speak on, or have you speak on that. Why so many layers of clothing, and how did they take care of it?
Uh, it's another one of these. I've always been really interested in some of the kind of mythologizing of the 19th century that has happened, especially around women's wear. I think the notion that that these women were kind of passive bystanders in their own lives because of what they wore
Mm.
is a real fallacy. The layers is interesting. I mean, there's certainly, this is a very much a kind of the idea of respectability in the 19th century is bound up with all sorts of complicated kind of complicated ideas that were starting to that were starting to emerge at that time. But I think primarily what's important is that women did have agency over their dress. So this wasn't about men kind of instructing them that they had to wear layers and that they had to winch their waists with ill-fitting corsets, and that they would then spend their time fainting onto couches. That didn't happen. Not many women tight laced. Tight lacing was a very kind of specific practice. Women wore corsets to support their bodies, and they wore the layers as part of this kind of notion of respectability. But they definitely lived full and active lives, not equal lives, of course, and they had horrific times in many ways. But I think dress was something that they did have a great deal of agency over. And I think, again, that's why it mattered to Anne. She was recording an area of her life and her friends' lives that they had a great deal of control around. And cloth kind of was important for that reason as well.
Mhm. You even discuss how, and it's something I'd never thought of, when they are wearing these layers of clothing, it's almost as if the outside layer that Anne is documenting in this diary is kind of just like spot cleaned and it's kept as pristine as possible. It's the under layers that are meant to be kind of like what we wear with t-shirts and stuff like that, where
Yeah,
you will sweat in those
yeah,
and they need
yeah.
a deeper cleaning, right?
Yeah, and that is of course the important functional reason for having those kind of layers, which is that the cotton undergarments, the shift or the chemise that you wore next to your skin, the linen drawers, those kinds of things were things that could be washed, could be laundered more easily. Obviously, it's all subjective and relative to your time and place. And then it meant that the outer layer was something that you would have very sophisticated ways of looking after. I think, again, another myth is that people couldn't effectively look after their garments in the 19th century, and that therefore it was that people just got used to not smelling clean, and that's not true either. You know, their undergarments were laundered pretty frequently for most people, and the outerwear, women had all sorts of sophisticated kind of recipes that they would have handed down or learn from other women about how to remove candle wax from from cloth, or how to get grease spots out. The kinds of knowledge that I think has been lost now. My grandmother was brilliant at it. She had all sorts of, I think perhaps she was one of the last generations to have attained that knowledge from her mother and grandmother. So the knowledge that they had to care for clothes in a much more considered way was something that perhaps we've lost now.
Mhm. Uh, you talk in there about, and in the book, about how Anne follows with her husband to Singapore, and I briefly said that earlier. But what was the experience like for someone like Anne to travel to such a foreign place? Because I believe it took, what, 4 months for them to get there. What was it like for her, and how does she document those kinds of events in her life?
This is where Anne is kind of frustratingly tight-lipped in many ways, because of course, it isn't a diary in the traditional sense, in that we never hear her voice. We never know what her feelings are. We never know what her experiences actually meant to her because of this distance. So it's always the name, the date, the person who wore it, and although it's broadly chronological, she doesn't give anything more away than that. And this is where actually the voice of the American that featured in the book of Maria Balestier was enormously helpful to kind of get a sense of that world, because there are 17 swatches in the album that belong to this Maria Balestier, and that's, anyone that's done genealogical research will know that an unusual name really is the researcher's friend. You know, you're much more likely to find something, and that's how it worked out. I just searched for Maria Balestier and found that she was the wife of the first American consul of Singapore. She was in fact Paul Revere's daughter, which was a really interesting kind of detail, unexpected detail. She was born and brought up in Boston, but had moved to Singapore in the early 1830s with her husband. And all of her letters that she wrote for a decade or more back home to her sister in Boston have all been kept and all been digitized by the Massachusetts Historical Society. So during the pandemic, I was sat at home reading these letters that Maria and her sister were writing back and forth. And it was just this window onto Maria's experience of living in the climate, which she found incredibly difficult. You know, the kind of the heat and humidity, having come from that spaces where she would have been used to much colder weather at different times of the year. The being somewhere that had kind of terrifying things like tiger attacks and things that were just beyond the realm of your experience as a young woman at that point. I also really felt that sense of distance. So like you say, it took Anne and Adam 4 months to get to Singapore from Liverpool, where they sailed in July 1840. And you get that sense from Maria's letters, because each of those letters that she sends to her sister takes 3 months to get back to Boston. And then her sister will reply, and that takes another 3 months to get back. And the isolation that's kind of represented by those dates really made me appreciate just how isolated these people were, you know, in terms of family and friends and the things that they knew best. And Anne and Adam lived there for 7 years. Adam was given the job of heading up merchant operations in the area, and so that's where they were for 7 years of their life.
And Anne even puts a bit of a pirate flag in this, which is way out, you know, a different way of doing things, but it's still fabric and it's still material.
Yeah. And it kind of, I think that spoke to perhaps the kind of why she was doing it in the first place, because it's such an unexpected addition. And what I love about that page of the album is that it features on the same page. So you have this red piece of wool at the top, which reads part of the pirate flag taken by the Admiral in Borneo, 1845. It's so unexpected. But then just underneath that is this little swatch of blue velvet that reads Adam's birthday slippers, 1846. And it's just the kind of that juxtaposition of international piracy and domestic footwear on the same page is brilliant. But I think she was kind of approaching people. So her friends and family knew that she was gathering these scraps to put in this album. And then she kind of took it a step further. And I think when she met people that she didn't know, she would somehow get onto the topic of her album and persuade them. I like to think persuade, although by all accounts, Admiral Cochrane, who was the admiral that gave her the piece of pirate flag, he was apparently quite a kind of pompous fellow. And so I do wonder if perhaps he had been slightly henpecked by this woman trying to get fabric from him, and that he relented eventually and gave her a piece of this flag. So it's a great, trying to imagine that scenario is one of the more unexpected parts of the book.
Mm-hmm. We briefly brought up earlier, but I'd love to dive into this for a few minutes here a little bit more, and that's the idea of mourning. And I have quite a few friends and colleagues who study mourning practices throughout the years and decades and centuries. And we often think of, as you say, Victoria and the consistency of her mourning until her death. Uh, with your book, you discuss certain aspects of mourning through the fabric and also through the commerce involved in that. I never knew that there were actual places you could go that just dedicated to mourning. There was a store for for mourning
Mm.
clothing and accessories and such. How do you think that our modern ideas of mourning are incorrect, or we need to readjust our thoughts on that based on what you saw through Anne's work and other pieces that you have done over the years?
That kind of very complicated code of mourning etiquette that existed in the 19th century did reach a peak of complexity that required books, instructional volumes, for example. So, particularly for women, there would be a very precise mode of presenting yourself to indicate what stage of mourning you were in, whether you were in the very first stages of mourning, whether you were entering more of a half mourning phase, which meant slightly different palette. These things were kind of codified into people's lives. In some sense, I've spoken to people more recently who have said, who have suffered loss and who have said, you know what, because having read that chapter, the idea that you can non-verbally indicate where you're at is a really interesting one. The idea that if you're wearing kind of paler colors or grays or mauves, that a certain length of time has passed and you don't have to say it with words, which I think is a really interesting idea, because although we do still associate black with mourning, I think now there's much more, very often there's that idea that we can be celebratory about life in those settings, and that the wearing of black is not always a kind of prerequisite for funerals or the grief that follows. So it's a really interesting, I think probably the most lasting association with mourning is what you touched on there, the kind of commercial aspect of it, which was the department store model. Essentially, the mourning warehouses allowed people to go very quickly into mourning because the expectation was that if you lost a relative, you had to display that very quickly. And being able to go to one store and get everything you needed in terms of clothing or stationery or jewelry, that it was all there, was convenient. And of course, this happening in the 1840s, the subsequent development of department stores, that, you know, the mourning warehouses had offered a really good model for that kind of experience. And that's probably the lasting impact of that we feel now.
It's a really interesting topic that I know a lot of people are seriously interested in. I have colleagues who still have yearly picnics in cemeteries because they would have back in the late 19th century and early 20th, excuse me. So it's a very interesting topic to consider, and it's
and
one
one that I
thing.
think we struggle with in terms of, you know, I did an exhibition years ago on the mourning jewelry, which is often the hair jewelry, and that provoked really strong reactions in visitors.
Really?
I think the idea of the hair from a dead person kind of freaks some people out. And yet in the 19th century, it was, in the absence of maybe many photographs or any photographs of your loved one, hair was this powerful kind of attachment to them, and there was no squeamishness whatsoever. So yeah, changing kind of ideas.
I've experienced that myself with people being squeamish about talking about death in general, because I've led battlefield tours with friends and such, and I'll talk about death, and they're like, "Well, please don't ruin our day with these kinds of stories." And I'm like, "Well, that's part of the story," you know.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I've definitely witnessed that where people get a little squeamish and they're like, we kind of shy away from that.
Mm, mm.
That's kind of a historical memory overload for some people, I guess. Uh, but with Anne Kate, how has she impacted your life other than the book? How else has she impacted how you see this period of time, or your life in general as a researcher and historian?
I think there are a couple things. The first thing is this sense of how she valued cloth.
Mhm.
Certainly, she was wealthy, and so she did have access to many different kinds of fabrics, and she was able to purchase it. That being said, she still valued them. It wasn't disposable. You know, you are looking at a period where cloth is an investment, and your clothes are an investment, and you treat them accordingly. And I think the care with which she attached these pieces into her album is a testament to that. And I think particularly I've for a long time been interested in a contemporary sense of how we change the model that we're in terms of fast fashion. And how do we reverse that? How do we
Mhm.
start to think about it differently? And I think there's much to be learned from this idea that you learn more about textiles, you learn about the clothes you buy, you take care of them, you learn how to mend them. Um, and these are things that I think we could learn from. You know, these were knowledgeable women. Um, the other thing is, I think for me, I realized that much of my career has been an interest in hidden women and women's stories that just don't get told. You know, many people have written about the experience of 19th century industrialists or merchants, somebody like Adam, and those early kind of early merchant communities living in Singapore. But very often it's just the men who are building the churches and the men who were contributing to the theatres, and their wives are always there. You know, they were always present, but there's never a kind of record of them. And so for me, I think it just kind of underscored that interest in finding women's voices that usually get neglected. And I don't think Anne could ever have imagined that this kind of object that she created for really for her own satisfaction, I guess, would have opened up this window onto her world, you know, 200 years later.
Mm. I think that many people who keep journals or diaries don't realize that at the time. And I spoke to you before we went live that I'm going to start keeping one on my next venture in life. And you've said that you've kept one
Mm,
for years, and it's therapeutic for us, or it can be therapeutic for us, but we don't really realize what whose hands that may end up in when we are long
mm,
past.
mm.
And how
Exactly, and the stories it tells of the times that we lived in.
Mhm, mhm. And how do you, or what kind of advice would you give to a historian of any age, but especially younger historians who appreciate this kind of history that still gets some eye rolls from time to time from people? What kind of advice would you give to them for their future studies, or just life in general, being a fashion historian or a material culture historian in general?
I would say just the idea of perseverance, it sounds a bit kind of trite and a bit of a well-trodden trope, but the idea of I think if you find your passion and you find your thing that you really that you just love and fires you up. I spent lots of years in between I'd have other jobs, but I would volunteer at the weekend at the local historic house and learn about dress there, and um, so just embrace it where you can, and don't ever underestimate where it might take you, because it's such an enriching kind of experience. I think objects, they can be enormously powerful, and however you are able to engage with them, um, and you won't necessarily be able to predict the path it will take you, but don't underestimate where it can go, even if it's just a few hours a week that you're able to kind of interact with something, or go to a place or see a thing. Yeah, you just never know where it might go.
Mm. That's fantastic. Well, Dr. Kate Strasdin, thank you so much for coming on and speaking with me about the dress diary. Anne was a tremendous person, and I'm so glad that she did what she did. And I'm so glad that you brought her to all of us.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. It's been great.